All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Katherine Hunt Brendish, clinical professor in the College of Health Solutions at ASU. I'd like to thank you all for joining our Health Talks webinar brought to you by the College of Health Solutions at ASU. Our college works to address the challenges facing people and communities to stay healthy, improve their health, and manage chronic disease. These health talks are one way that we serve the community with timely and relevant educational information that also provides continuing education credit at no cost. And now for a quick few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded and it will be posted on our website, asuhealthtalks.com. After the panelist presentation, I will moderate a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature and not the chat box. And finally, you will receive a brief survey asking for your input about today's webinar. If you are requesting continuing education credits, this must be completed in order to receive the credit. If you did not apply for CEUs, we would still really appreciate your feedback to improve our series. All right. On to today's topic. Today's topic is decoding genetics, direct-to-consumer genetic testing and services in Arizona. And I will be today's first presenter. Again, my name is Katherine Hunt Brendish, and I am the director of the ASU Genetic Counseling Program and clinical professor at the College of Health Solutions. I have 27 years of experience as a clinical genetic counselor, where I have worked in the areas of prenatal, pediatrics, and adult genetics. Prior to joining Arizona State University, I worked at the Mayo Clinic for 13 years, specializing in the areas of cancer, neurology, and cardiology. While at Mayo Clinic, I obtained my PhD in biology. My dissertation and research interests focus on informed consent for whole genome sequencing. Then I will be followed by Dr. Derek Neilson. Dr. Neilson has been Division Chief for Genetics and Metabolism at Phoenix Children's Hospital for the last 5 years, where he has been working on developing and growing the genetics program. He completed his residency in pediatrics and genetics in 2003 at University Hospitals of Cleveland, and then spent 10 years at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Dr. Neilson has been involved in gene discovery and research for neurologic disorders and also disorders of connective tissue. Most recently, Dr. Neilson has implemented a residency for medical genetics and genomics with the intention of increasing the number of genetics professionals within the state of Arizona, which I am super excited about. We are very fortunate and honored to have Dr. Neilson with us today as we explore the value of direct-to-consumer genetic testing and utility to clinical practice, as well as the genetic provider resources available in Arizona. We know this is going to be a really worthwhile topic for everybody. So just a bit of a background before I dive in. For my part of the presentation, I'm just going to give everybody a really high-level overview of what is direct-to-consumer testing. I want to focus a lot on what are the promises versus what's the reality of these tests. I'll go into a bit about how they're performed, what type of information do we get from these tests, and then I will also spend a little bit of time talking about how direct consumer testing differs from clinical testing. And then Dr. Neilson is going to help me out here. We're going to talk about how you discuss these tests with your provider. And then if you're a consumer listening today, I also want to give you some background that will help you better understand the clinical utility of these tests. Okay, so with that background, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this will work out just beautifully. All right. So let's dive in here to our topic, the meaty part of our session. All right. I have absolutely no doubt that many of you listening today are familiar with this company. This is a screenshot from a YouTube video that was put out by 23andMe advertising their product. And I have to admit, 23andMe has done a fantastic job with their advertising campaign. The kit you see here on the kit, it says, "Welcome to you." What they've done is they've essentially gotten at the heart of what people want to know about themselves is through their DNA. So many of us associate our DNA with who we are, with our identity, our personality, our traits, and not just our health status. In addition, by learning about your genes, you're learning about your family, right? And so what 23andMe has done over the years is a phenomenal job really putting this type of product or this service out to the consumer at large without having to go to your doctor's office. So there's a lot of enticing components to why people pursue direct consumer testing that we're going to talk about. And for all their hard work, 23andMe has now just reached their 12 million customers. So they've done a phenomenal job. Not to be outdone, though, by our ancestry companies. So ancestry testing is a little bit different than 23andMe. 23andMe offers a little bit of more health information that I'm going to go into in a lot more detail in just a minute. Ancestry testing is what it says it is. And this just happens to be a screenshot from the website for Ancestry DNA. They now have just indicated that they have 15 million customers in their database, which is, again, quite a large number. They are looking at helping consumers find lost relatives, helping people understand what part of the world they're from, and helping, I guess, people that didn't realize they had distant relatives that they were related to, helping them match with their distant relatives. Bottom line, both of these direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies are making promises to consumers that include improving health outcomes, opportunities to find lost relatives, and finding and filling in the gaps of your family tree. In short, if you undergo genetic testing through any of these companies, your life is going to get better, either through your health or your relationships. So while this all may be actually very true, what are some of the unforeseen outcomes, if you will, of these types of tests? Now, this is going on just about 3 years from the 3 years ago that the Golden State Killer was identified. And as many of you know from all the media that came out, the gentleman is Joseph DeAngelo, is the name of the Golden State Killer. The federal investigators were able to track him down and identify him as the killer for many unsolved rapes and homicides over a period of time frame, decades. And they were able to do this by actually matching his DNA from one of the crime scenes to DNA that was uploaded from one of the ancestry companies. So I'm going to get back to how this all happened. But what the point here is that some people do ancestry testing without realizing that there could be consequences of how they share their information. And there may be considerations of privacy that aren't always very well delineated on the websites for some of these companies. So it's something for us to keep in mind as we explore some of these questions. So in the next few minutes before I hand it off to Dr. Neilson, I'm going to talk a little bit about how direct-to-consumer genetic testing can potentially be harmful, either to you or to relatives, and do these tests live up to their promises? What happens to the data that gets collected? Is it secure? What happens if your results are positive for a condition that might be inherited? And then will your results be shared with your healthcare provider? Before we get there, though, I really want to level the playing field and start with some definitions. There are a tremendous number of direct consumer tests on the market. At this time, it's impossible for us to keep up. We don't plan on talking about all of them today. Instead, what I'd rather do is take a step back and focus on definitions for what we're looking at. Any type of genetic test that is marketed directly to the consumer without the involvement of a health professional is what we're going to focus on. So in this scenario, patients are initiating these tests themselves online typically, but you can go to Target. You used to be able to go to Target to buy these in different drugstores. Results are not provided to you by your medical provider, and many people who are interested in these tests are healthy, okay? Now, another definition from the National Society of Genetic Counselors says that this type of testing is consumer-driven testing, basically. Just as a little bit about a history, for those of you who aren't as familiar with this space, it's not ironic that about 3 years after the completion of the Human Genome Project, 2 direct-to-consumer tests came out on the market. The first one was from a company called Genetics, and that was in California. They offered 20 medical conditions including diabetes, prostate cancer, and glaucoma for about $1,000. And then shortly after that, not to be outdone, 23andMe launched their first product in 2007. They quickly gained a very strong reputation in the media and became the best retail DNA test of the year of 2008. So I mentioned it's not ironic that this happened shortly after the completion of the Human Genome Project, only because the Human Genome Project and the technology involved in that project allowed companies like these two to offer testing at a more affordable cost. And so these companies just took advantage of that, if you will, but they also had a strong interest in providing the service. 23andMe did not go off without some bumpy components to the process. Just after releasing it, a lot of medical professionals, including geneticists and others, were very concerned. And we were concerned about the fact that maybe consumers are being misled. Maybe they don't completely understand what they're getting into. So the California Department of Public Health sent a cease and desist letter to 23andMe saying, you have to pull off your product until you demonstrate that you've certified this test by state and federal government authorities and that you're ordering through a physician. The company continued to offer their products. So in 2013, the FDA got involved and sent a warning letter to 23andMe, asking them to bring their product up to speed with FDA requirements, which was actually done. 23andMe did comply, and some of their medical tests that I'll talk about have been approved by the FDA. Again, I mentioned 23andMe is the most popular company out there right now, and they were the top selling holiday gift in 2017. So there's a tremendous amount of interest that we have to be aware of out there. So what are these companies offering? First of all, it just depends on the company and it depends on what their interests are. The majority of direct-to-consumer testing that I'm referring to, where there's no provider involved, is going to offer mainly just ancestry information. 23andMe does offer more than that. So they offer information about our traits, some of which are kind of interesting. My favorites are cilantro aversion and fear of public speaking. They also offer ice cream flavor and fear of heights as your traits. These companies offer wellness information that include deep sleep, propensity, and your genetic weight, just as an example. And then 23andMe does offer a health panel. And in that health panel, they can include genetic conditions that are hereditary, like breast cancer, as a big example, as well as some other genetic conditions. A lot of those tests are FDA approved, but they don't, and I'm going to get into this in just a minute, they don't cover all the different traits that are out there. Other kinds of traits they offer is anxiety, AFib, status, and asthma propensity. Okay. In addition to that, a lot of these companies have added on a pharmacogenomics component, which Dr. Neilson is going to talk about in just a minute. Just to put this in perspective, the cost of the test started out at about $1,000. Now we're looking at about $220 to do all the different conditions that I just listed and ancestry testing. We get a lot of questions in genetics about, well, do you need to take blood? How do you get my sample? Is it painful? And that's the beauty of direct-to-consumer testing. Absolutely easy as you can expect, as you would want. You go online, you purchase a kit, you order this through the company directly again. They send you a little tube, a plastic tube, and a box for you to send back. So you can do this in the convenience of your own home, spit into the tube, send it back, and then results are reported directly to the consumer in a portal that they can log into and access. Nothing is directly shared with the medical provider at this point. Okay, let's get into a side-by-side comparison. This will kind of get you prepped for Dr. Neilson's component of the talk today. What is the difference between a direct-to-consumer genetic test and a clinical test that the medical geneticists world is all about? So in direct-to-consumer, it's the consumer's curious, usually. They're usually very healthy individuals. Typically, they're not affected, and they're focusing on staying healthy or figuring out what they're at risk for so they can do something to prevent diseases in the future. On the flip side of that, if you go to a geneticist in a genetics clinic, you're getting a test ordered for diagnostic purposes. So the doctor's interested in learning what disease you might have by doing a genetic analysis. Sometimes people are healthy and they're just doing genetic testing for the purposes of carrier screening before they have children. And others are interested in to know whether they will develop a disease in the future, such as cancer or dementia, as just two examples. And it's not just about why people are doing testing that make these tests very different. Direct-to-consumer testing technology is radically different than clinical genetic testing technology. And this is a side-by-side comparison. I won't go through every little component here, but just to make 2 points. One, if you're doing a direct-to-consumer test, you're looking at a handful, it could be hundreds to thousands of variants that are found throughout our entire genome. So these are base pair changes that we have, all that are unique to each other, but some of them are linked to diseases or traits, and some are linked to our ancestry. The variants that these tests that these companies are using have been usually linked to big databases. And so the more members that you have in the database, the better the results will be. And that's true for ancestry testing. In clinical genetic testing, this is a simplification of what happens, but in general, the testing, it does a much deeper dive into the genome, and there's various different methods of diving into the genome that I don't go into here. But the point is, it looks at bigger chunks of the genome in different ways with different types of technology, and they can be layered on top of each other. So you can do whole exome, whole genome sequencing. You can identify different types of variants, not just single base pair changes like you do with the direct consumer test. And you have different kinds of results that come out at the end of it all. Dr. Neilson will get into a little bit more on this in just a minute. This is a screenshot from the website of 23andMe that talks about how they report. So basically, they're looking at a variant here that is linked to celiac disease, and the report comes back saying you don't have the variant. But does that mean this person won't get celiac disease? No, it doesn't. It just says you don't carry the variant that they were looking for. And every lab looks for different variants depending on how they set up their tests, et cetera. Okay, let's move away from health now and talk about ancestry. There's been a ton of movement in ancestry over the last few years. There's a lot of different companies, some of which I've listed here as examples on the slide here. The cost will vary depending on how many services you want to take a part of. So you might just want your DNA looked at, or you may want help with your genealogy. Most ancestry companies are not doing health information. That has changed. Ancestry DNA was offering health information about health conditions up until, I guess, a few years ago. But just last night, they on their website, they posted that they are offering dog or canine DNA testing as part of their new service, which I'm a little bit tickled by. So they are continuously trying to find new marketing strategies all the time. Each company, though, is looking at different markers throughout the genome. So they're going to give different information about your ancestry, and the results will vary from company to company. And people are always confused, like why they sent their sample to one company and it said that they were from this part of the world, but another company said they were from a different part. And this is why. I mentioned already that some companies do offer lifestyle information. Ancestry is the main one that I found that will do that. And they'll look at things that are kind of standard traits like hair type, earwax type, and so on. So those are just some examples: exercise, recovery, nutrition ideas, etc. The last category I'll briefly touch on is that some direct-to-consumer testing companies do involve a physician. These are going to be things that are going to be more clinical, like carrier screening, cancer screening for hereditary disorders, and pharmacogenomics. A doctor is involved at some point along the way. It may be initiated by a consumer, but a physician that's usually hired by the company is involved in writing the order for the test and looking at results and talking to the consumer. And then last, I'll mention the fact that after you do the direct consumer testing, you have the option to get your raw data. So you get an option to get all those variants. that were looked at by these companies. Now, to us, it won't mean anything, but you are able to upload your raw data to a third-party company who will then do an analysis of that data, and depending on what company it is, will tell you whether you have ancestors that you don't know about. And this is actually GED Match, was the company that was used in the Golden State Killer case to help track down Joseph. And so that is one company that has gone under some criticism for their privacy laws that we'll talk about next, as it relates to direct consumer testing. You can also upload your data to companies that will look for health information. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the pitfalls of that in just a second. So you have the option to get your raw data and then send it to another company at your discretion, who will then do another analysis and look for different variants associated with diseases. So what is the upshot of all of this before I pass this off to Dr. Neilson? So I think what we're looking at here is that direct consumer testing is extraordinarily engaging for people. It's extraordinarily attractive for people. It's engaging the community in genetics, which I personally love. It's helping educate people about genetics, again, which I really think is wonderful. Consumers use it to help identify relatives. They're learning about technology. They can participate in research if they so desire. And it's affordable, right? It's $200. A lot of folks will pay for it out of pocket. And some people find information they wouldn't have otherwise found about their health status. People do it for curiosity. It's convenient. You don't have to go to your doctor's office, which in this day and age is a bonus sometimes. And sometimes people walk away thinking this information will give them insights into their health. But I want to come back to some of the pitfalls and possible implications. Since this case was solved with the Golden State Killer, I will say that there's been a lot of work done on the privacy component of these tests, especially ancestry testing. The ancestry companies, there were two big companies that were involved in helping federal investigators track down the Golden State Killer. And they were under a lot of criticism after this article came out. The companies defended themselves and said that, yes, we do keep our clients' information private, but if it's a case that's this serious, then we had every right to share the data. Also, the U.S. Justice Department has put some restrictions on the ability for FBI and other federal investigators to take this DNA information from these companies. If you have the right court order, you can still access some of this information for cases to help solve crimes, and it's still ongoing at this time. You also have to remember that people are willingly uploading their data to these third-party companies. So it's kind of on them to sort of figure out some of these privacy issues prior to doing that. And the websites have gotten better about informing people. So one of the risks that I found when I talk to consumers is sometimes they don't really understand all these limitations that I went over today, and some that Dr. Neilson is going to talk about in a minute. They may understand a little bit about it, but not everything about it. Also, a lot of people assume that this is the same thing as going to your doctor and seeing Dr. Neilson, for example, and getting a test done in his office, and that's not the case. A big misnomer is that people feel like if they do direct consumer testing and everything's negative, then they're good to go and they'll never get any diseases. And we definitely want to dispel that misconception. I feel, and I think others, that there's limited clinical validity and utility of some of these results. I will mention that on the website for 23andMe, even though they look at hereditary conditions, it states very clearly this is not to be used for medical management decisions, and you should have this test validated. And then, like I mentioned already, negative results can have false reassurances. Another large concern that comes across our desks a lot as genetic counselors is that the raw data is, so people take their raw data to other companies and have it analyzed. A lot of analyses of this is incomplete or inaccurate, and they were told they have a disease and they didn't actually have that disease. So you really have to be careful and know what you're getting into before you do that. Is there really a way to de-identify your DNA? I'm not quite sure on that one. And then people don't always know that genetic information has some protections from discrimination in the health insurance realms, but not for life insurance or long-term disability insurance. So there are some parts of our genetic information that still isn't protected, and people don't always know that going into these tests. These are some list of some of the journal articles that have come out over the last few years that have listed the concerns that the medical community has found with direct consumer testing. A lot of it adds up to the promises don't match with what actually happens at the end of the test. A lot of people have voiced their actual dissatisfaction because when they get their report, they take it to their doctor and their doctor says, but I didn't order it. I don't work in this area. I don't really know how to apply this to your health. And that leaves a lot of people dissatisfied. I've seen that happen a lot here in clinics as well. And then some sad cases of people that have come back with some findings that were detrimental to their family. And these are some examples. People do find relatives they didn't want to find, or they find out that their dad wasn't their dad, and somebody didn't realize that that was part of the test. So somebody going into it very innocently didn't realize they would figure out that somebody in their family was having an affair, and they have a relative that they didn't know or that wasn't their dad, for example. So these are another kind of warnings of what to make people aware of. Responding to patients, I think, in a positive way, though, helping people understand these facts, helping them educate them on the cause of diseases, and discussing some of these implications that we've gone over today would be a really good first start when getting people who are interested in testing. We don't want to discourage it 100%, but we just definitely want people to be fully aware of what they're getting into and what the consequences are. And this is just a little bit more about helping people understand their motivations, educating people about knowing more about family history and the basics of genetics, and some of the limitations I've already talked about. So Dr. Neilson, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this talk today. I'd also like to thank Carl and Brett for their technical support. And I also want to thank 23andMe for making cilantro aversion a real thing. I have that. Cilantro tastes like soap or metal to me, and nobody has believed me for a really long time. So thank you for making that something validated and real. Now, nobody can call me crazy anymore, at least not for that reason. Next slide, Kelly. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is, so if you have questions about DTC or other kind of genetics, what are the resources out there available for you? And one of the issues that I've run into over the past is that not everybody actually understands what is available. So when I was a resident, people would ask, or when I was going into medical school, people would ask, what are you going to do? I'm going to do genetics. And they would say, you can do that. And the other response I would get is, oh, so you're going to do genetic counseling. Well, not exactly. So first of all, a clinical geneticist like myself is a physician. We are MD trained, and we've gone through a residency. And that might be a 2-year categorical residency where you've already done a primary residency, say in pediatrics or internal medicine or something like that. Or there's also now a 4-year combined program, which might be both pediatrics and genetics at the same time, or internal medicine and genetics. And our job is to do diagnosis by history, physical exam, and traditional diagnostic testing, x-rays, MRIs, et cetera, as well as genetic testing. In addition, once we've done all those diagnostic maneuvers, then we're going to be involved in lab interpretation. And yes, we will do the counseling as well. But we also are involved in management. So we may be ordering tests downstream from that, following up with our patients over the years to keep check on certain kinds of aspects. And this is especially true for the metabolic disorders. Next slide. Whoops, one slide back. And in addition, we have many genetic counselors, and genetic counselors provide many roles. Some of those roles are as they work with us in the evaluation of patients, but they can also have independent roles as well, where they are doing the genetic counseling relatively on their own. Genetic counselors go through a 2-year master's program following college, and what they are capable of doing at the end is diagnosis by history, which is largely centered on pedigree analysis as well as other clinical information. information, data review, and genetic testing. Now, the question is, well, do they order the genetic testing? And that can actually vary from state to state. In most states, the term that is used is identify and coordinate genetic testing. And some states will actually have licensure and along with prescription authority where a genetic counselor can actually do all those steps. In other cases, a genetic counselor may be working with a physician where the counselor may arrange for all the testing and the physician is signing off on it as a final order. In addition to that process, genetic counselors will also be involved in lab interpretation and counseling of those results. And so so many of you may be familiar with genetic counselors who are working in the prenatal arena, where they are doing the majority of that particular position with minimal involvement. We also see that genetic counselors also perform a similar role in cancer counseling. So in many states, 35 of them, there is licensure for genetic counselors. This has not gone through Arizona legislature to date. That is one of the ongoing projects here. The main difference is that GCs with licensure can actually independently see their patients, although the billing issue is still kind of often more like a nurse practitioner where it may be incident too. Okay, move forward. You may also see some other variations on genetic resources. One of those is nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners, of course, will have gone through their NP program, and then as part of their employment, they may have received on-the-job training to do diagnostics and counseling based on genetic disorders. Some have gone through a certificate program, which used to exist, but that program was actually shut down a few years back. But that one actually gave more classic kind of lectures on genetics that they would take. Nurse practitioners usually practice within a limited range, so we've seen these more often with either neurologic disorders or in connective tissue disorders. There are some nurses who have also gone through the certificate program. They tend not to have the same kind of direct roles, but sometimes they are involved in coordinating testing as well as with care coordination down the line. And then we can't forget that there are many general providers or even specialty providers who work with genetics. For example, it is very standard for obstetrician gynecologists to send off genetic testing without involving a geneticist or GCs as a process, just based on the availability. So those providers may be working more directly with the labs. Sometimes they're going to be talking with a GC who works at a lab to arrange that ordering, interpretation, and sometimes to help provide that counseling downstream. And so the providers may rely on additional expertise for results return and management, especially when unusual things are found. Often what we're seeing is that general providers may start some testing, but if something comes back positive, they often are referred on to counselors or genetic physicians. Next slide. And so the question in Arizona is, how feasible is it if your patient has questions about their genetics and want further information about DTC that they've had, or they've got a genetic disorder? What are the resources that we have? In Arizona, we currently have 7 pediatric trained geneticists. All of those are in Phoenix. We have 2 internal medicine trained geneticists, 1 in Tucson and 1 in Phoenix. There are 4 nurse practitioners. And then there are 27 genetic counselors. 21 of those are in Phoenix and 6 are in Tucson. Now, so the question again is this enough? And the answer is quite clearly no. At Phoenix Children's, we have approximately a 9-month waiting list, and that is the waiting list to be scheduled. And that would be actually putting it out another 6 months potentially. The numbers on that list are in the 900 to 1,000 or something like that. And so the issue that we're running into is that with our genetic technologies, the amount of patients that are now diagnosable have gone up by a factor of 100. So it used to be that the most common disorder that we would see would be on the order of 1 in 5,000. Now we can actually make diagnoses in autism at a rate of approximately 40%, epilepsy also rate of around 40%, and many other disorders. And so now our populations are coming from a population percentile of 1 to 2%. So we've had about 100-fold increase in the number of patients that are available to be seen, but we do not have an increase in a proportional increase in the number of genetics trained physicians or genetic counselors. So for comparison, and I use Ohio because it's a little bit bigger than Arizona, but I can trace where everybody is a lot more easily. And so when I left Ohio, and still currently, there is approximately 2.7 doctors per million population. In Arizona, we have about 1.3 docs per million. So we have about half of what they do proportionally. And in Ohio, there are 11 genetic counselors per million population. We're at 3.85. So we're really behind the curve in the number of providers that we have. And that's why we've really been working on developing residency program, as well as now there are 2 genetic counseling training programs, one at ASU, one at University of Arizona, to really try and help address this gap. However, it is going to take some time. Next slide. So one of the things that I've seen a lot is that providers are saying, well, can I just order the test? And the answer is actually you can, but the question is, do you really want to? So there are 2 caveats here. One is that there are a number of insurance companies that have language in their system that says basically they'll cover the genetic test if genetic counseling has been given by a qualified provider. And that's the little clause that they can use to block the ordering of a test. Which may mean that either the test doesn't get run, or on the backside, the patient may get a bill for a few $1,000s, and because they said, well, you didn't go through our process. Therefore, it's all self-pay now. The other is that you need to make sure that you are doing consent, and that it is actually not just, do you feel like doing it, but rather that you go through all the ins and outs of the test. This is actually a part of the state law, which says that a person shall not order or require the performance of a genetic test without first receiving the specific written informed consent of the subject. And so we actually have there are institution-specific documents to do this. What we typically cover on these are the possibility of uncovering uncomfortable things like consanguinity or non-paternity. We talk about genetic information non-discrimination, what that covers and what it doesn't cover. We also talk about who could actually look at your genetic testing, because it's not just your doctor. There's others that could look at it too, only under certain circumstances, and a few other things like that. So there's a lot that actually goes into it. So it's actually about a 15-minute conversation when we do it. So the question is, if you feel comfortable with all of that, then that's probably a reasonable thing to do. So practically speaking, though, the other part is just thinking about what happens when you get that result on the downstream, and it comes back with something that says, we found the variant of uncertain significance. There are these genes that have been duplicated within this segment. Some of them are known to cause disease and some of them are not. And then knowing that you might have to be sitting on some information while your patient is waiting to be seen by a geneticist to help them figure out what exactly are we talking about with any of this stuff. The tough part is that, we have to, as a geneticist, become experts on things that we've never seen before, because there's 20,000 different genes. And, right now, if we're talking about autism, for example, there are 3,000 known causes of autism at a genetic level. So sifting through all that information is part of our process, and trying to help a person understand, is this one that's important, or is this actually not important? These can be tricky processes. And so you have to be prepared that your patient may take the information and run with it without having that advice available immediately. So just a practical consideration as you go forward with that. Next slide. So a few things that I want to talk about is that, so now you've got some decisions to make as to, okay, do I order something? Do I not order something? And what do I actually work with? And one of those areas is pharmacogenetics. Now, pharmacogenetics has been getting better, but it's one of the things that I've not necessarily been terribly happy with over the years, because what they're looking at is genetic variants that help you process the drugs that you're taking into excretable or inactivated forms, or sometimes activated forms. And so what those genes usually tell you is how do they affect the pharmacokinetics. This can actually be very helpful if, because it can tell you if a drug is going to give you side effects with your initial dosage. Should you scale it lower? It may give you some indication of adverse effects. And there's a whole group, the CPIC, Clinical Pharmacogenetics Implementation Consortium, which is a federal group that is a collaboration between researchers and commercial laboratories. And what they're doing is coming out with position statements on what does this test actually tell you, and is that this actually useful? So it's a nice group. And if you've got results back, that's one place to start with, because you can actually look up the gene and figure out what are we talking about. Next slide. The thing about pharmacogenetics where I'm not so happy about it is that although it tells you how well might your patient process that gene, it doesn't tell you if the drug, it doesn't tell you if that drug's actually going to work. And so this is something I've seen where a patient will come in and they've done the testing and every single drug is in the red zone, meaning don't use that one. Well, actually, it doesn't mean don't use it. Those are just the ones that say, there might be issues with this particular drug and its action, and you might want to adjust your dosing. But how people interpret it is, does it work, does it not work? When they put it into green, yellow, and red zones, patients have this expectation that only the green ones are good. And it's hard to kind of disabuse them of that. Now, technically, just about anyone or everyone should have pharmacogenetics. I suppose the companies would love it if everyone did, but that means that's really way too many patients for your local geneticist to be handling. So what we've had to do with the pharmacogenetics is really say, if this is something that you're interested in doing, this really has to stay in the hands of the ordering physician, because ultimately, you're the one that's going to be making a decision about what to use. This may help you direct how you use it, but just remember, even if something's in that red zone, it may still be worth trying. The other thing to know is that reimbursement by insurance company has been spotty. Most of the time, these end up being self-pay. Fortunately, they're often not very expensive. Next slide. Another thing that comes up is MTHFR. And this is the gene that I love to hate. This has been around since as long as I've been in genetics. And what happens is there's always a whole bunch of energy because everyone figures out, hey, maybe MTHFR is part of something. And then a few years later, no, actually, it doesn't do anything at all. And I've seen that cycle again and again as new groups suddenly realize, hey, maybe we could treat something with folate. And the thing about this is that MTHFR has two alleles, the C677T and A1298C. And those are both present in about 40% of the population, which means that you can get two copies of either one of those or both in about 16%. So it's very common variants. And because they're so common, they actually exist on those Ancestry and 23andMe tests. And so when people crack those things open with some third-party software, then they suddenly say, oh my gosh, I've got MTHFR, and now I need to see a doctor because somebody's got to figure out how to give me folate. And what we've learned is that this really doesn't seem to matter that much. So when we look at American College of Medical Genetics, they say stop testing for coagulopathy. American College of OB/GYN, do not test for DVTs or pregnancy complications. Do not use this for cardiac disease or stroke risk factors. CDC, you do not need to adjust your dosage for neural tube defects. And the CPIC also says that this is the preponderance of evidence for this is pretty weak. The thing about this is that it's a very easy allele to test, and so it's gained a lot of traction because it's easy to test, and maybe we can do something about it. But most of those have really not come about because all those tests are really retrospective associations, and they do not confer predictive value. And that's one of the main things to remember. These do not provide any kind of prediction. In fact, you can actually do, this is one of my fun things that I do with the residents, is take any common disease and search that disease and MTHFR and PubMed. You will find a positive association for that disease and the phrase, further studies are needed. You never end up seeing those further studies because presumably they never pan out and people don't tend to publish those negative studies. The only one I've seen that actually does not correlate with MTHFR turns out to be acne. That's the only one I've found so far that they actually published a paper that says, turns out this one doesn't do it. Okay, next thing. So what do you do when patients come in and they've printed off an entire stack of papers saying, here's my entire genome, take a look at it and see what you think? First of all, nobody's going to do that. Even the geneticists, we cannot sift through that amount of information. And what you really want to do is figure out, okay, what are we really trying to ask as a question? And often it comes down to, I'm really worried about such and such disorder. And I've had patients, for example, come in having done this test because they were really worried about, for say, vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And they said, and here's my results, and I know I'm going to die before the age of 40 because I have 11 variants in collagen 3, which tell me I'm going to die. And what you look at is you can actually pull those up on the NIH databases, and you can see that, okay, all of these are intronic, they're all known variants, none of those are actually disease conferring. So what you really want to do is get them into the hands of somebody who can actually do the real testing to say, do you really have a risk for collagen 3? And test that one directly at the sequence level, not at these little points that are located in and around the gene. So to do that, for some of these questions, they may actually just be perfectly appropriate to work with a genetic counselor, and you can locate genetic counselors through the NSGC, and there's also the Arizona Genetics Alliance, which has member resources, and these are different ways to help get your patient to where they need to be. But I think the one thing that you have to help your patients understand is that the DTC testing is really not clinically actionable or validated. And we've also seen this in different ways as well. One of my patients came in because they had pancreatitis. You can actually get directed testing, whole genome. They'll sequence everything for you if you want. And it said that this patient has a gene, genetic change in a gene that causes pancreatitis. It looks like a match, except that when they went to GI said, we're not so sure, retested that gene, didn't find it on clinical testing. We redid that test at a different lab, also did not find that. And so what we were looking at on that whole genome, which was from a very good group, was a false positive. So we have to remember that if these are not coming from a clinical group, you may be getting false positives, false negatives, all sorts of unusual things because they're not taking the next step of clinically validating that result. All right, and at this point, thank you, everybody, and we'll be happy to take questions for the minutes that we have remaining.
All right, thank you, Dr. Neilson. That was wonderful. Okay, so I have a couple of questions already in here, so let me start with that. First question is, do they look for different variants of the same thing, i.e. one would show that they don't have the variant for celiac, but another one would? If that is the case, does that fuel misinformation and mistrust in the medical community? So I think if I understand this question, they only look for a certain number of variants that are set up in their assay, and it's usually just one or two that they're looking at. It is that will be described in the technical language, but they're not looking, I guess that in the upshot of it is they're not looking at all the different variants that are associated with that disease. Dr. Neilson, would you have anything to add to that or agree?
Right, and usually what they're looking for, so this is for celiac, but we see this thing for, inflammatory bowel disease too, where they can look for genetic markers that are associated with the disorder. But remember that associations are retrospective. And so my dumb example is like, if you go outside and it's raining, you can see clouds, therefore they're highly associated. But if you go outside and you see clouds, is it raining? Will it rain? Not in Arizona. So that's kind of the difference between the testing from many of these labs versus what do they actually tell you. The way they have been identified, these genetic changes, in many cases are completely backwards from how we want to use them, and we cannot use them in a forward-looking fashion. So this can be a little bit difficult. And that analogy is usually what I use to explain for patients.
Okay. So another couple of questions are coming back. Has the explosion of at-home testing during COVID pandemic caused challenges or confusion with respect to patients or consumers seeking direct-to-consumer testing? Not that I'm aware of. I think the same confusion or challenges that were there before COVID are still there. There was, for sure, I think that, Michael, I appreciate you putting this question. I do think there was a big explosion for at-home testing during the COVID pandemic. But I haven't seen it from the clinical side. Dr. Neilson's more involved with patient care and interfacing with patients right now than I am. So maybe you've seen more patients come to you with these tests after COVID.
I don't think it hit us any differently than it was before. I would say that one of the things the pandemic did for us is it required us to suddenly depend a lot more on at-home cheek swabs. And so now we have a resource that didn't exist before, because everything before then was you had to do a blood draw. And that was really problematic, especially if you were trying to get pre-auth and your patient was going to go back to Lake Havasu and you're trying to figure out now how to get the blood draw now that we got the pre-auth. Now what we do is we just say, oh, we're going to do it by mail. And here's your kit and just send it back in. So the pandemic was actually helpful for us in improving the access.
That's a great point. I would agree 100% on that. All right, second question. This is for you, Dr. Neilson. The type of testing you described for pancreatitis, are they actually doing sequencing or SNP analogy? And if sequencing, are they categorizing the variants as pathogenic, VUS, benign, etc.?
So the sequencing that patient had was sequencing the gene. There are, I think, maybe 3 or 4 genes now. I don't remember exactly. At least there's a few that are very common and maybe a few that are fairly uncommon. And that one, that particular case, that patient had actually had the entire genome sequenced. So they sequenced the gene as well as all the intronic regions. So it wasn't just, specific points. And they did come back with a variant which had been identified previously as being pathogenic. So it was called pathogenic. And the problem with that is that particular lab doesn't necessarily give you that service. So they'd had to kind of do a little extra work to figure that out. But then that variant later on just didn't hold up. And of course, all these things are going to come back with when we test that gene, you are going to find VUSs as well as well-described mutations.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, a couple more questions here. Have there been any cases where someone claims ancestry to a certain group that they may have legal or economic consequences and the genetic test is negative? Oh, that's a fantastic question, Dr. Sklar. So do they use ancestry testing, in other words, to gain something that they're looking at? I'm not aware personally of any case like that, but I don't work in the ancestry space as often. Do you know, Dr. Neilson, yourself?
No, I mean, I've not, that's not a question that tends to come across our desk very often. So I haven't seen that. I have had patients come in, and this was well before ancestry.com existed, asking, could we do testing? Because if I can prove that I'm Native American, I'm eligible for scholarships or something like that. And so I think, a person could potentially, and I have heard of similar instances like that recently. So I imagine that there could be some people that were expecting that they might be eligible for financial aid, which it didn't come out because of that. But that would be the only example that I could really think of. But again, not really our space. Yeah,
but that is a good example, though. I can see that. Another question is, this is I'll give this one to you, Dr. Neilson. What is the process for a new genetic variant to gain recognition as a risk factor for a trait or disease in genetic testing? Is there a formal protocol, or can a single GWAS study suffice?
Well, the last question first, no. Single study is never going to be enough. Yeah. So the process, Yeah, and the problem is that this is going to vary a little bit about depending on whether you're talking about a rare disease versus a common disease. With rare disorders, because they're so unusual, if we find something that's brand new, meaning like it's a brand new genetic variant, or this is something that we see this only in the affected person and we never ever see it anytime else, that's information that we can use that can be very helpful in pushing that forward as a candidate gene. Once we have a candidate gene where we got a genetic variant in it, there's a couple of additional steps before it actually becomes accepted as causative. Some of that may be, a lot of it is actually replication. You want to see that same gene doing the same, creating the same kind of phenotype over and over again, either with the same genetic change or with very similar kinds of genetic changes. For example, if it causes a premature stop codon here and somebody also has a premature stop codon, but it's somewhere else, that's still acceptable because we would expect them to behave the same way in a loss of function kind of form. So first of all is replication. Then we also want to see, are there biochemical or animal or other kinds of studies that would support that the genetic variant actually causes a detrimental effect to the protein or to the organism in a similar fashion as you would predict as is happening in your patient. So some of these would be if you're talking about metabolic disorders where we can actually show that at a metabolic level or an enzyme level, that enzyme's just missing. And we can find that that gene has those genetic changes that are removing that. That's very good evidence. And if we have more than one patient, that's very helpful. So that's when we're talking about rare diseases, replication, animal studies, other kinds of models to provide that biological validation. When you're talking about common disorders, if you're talking, for example, about diabetes, that's where it gets really tricky because now you're having to include potentially many different genetic factors as well as environmental factors on top of that. And so when I laugh about GWAS, it's because normally with the GWAS, everyone goes, okay, that's nice. Now do another one, do a bigger one, do it in a different population. Because what we want to see is, again, that replication. Do these variants actually show you what you're expecting under every circumstance? And then also, where are those variants? What are they actually doing? The problem with GWAS is that it's based on a technology where all of the variants are typically in and around genes. And what you're trying to do is find a marker that's not necessarily causative in and of itself, but is next to something that is causative. And so what you're trying to look at is what's the next neighboring gene and how is that functioning? And the problem is that sometimes those genes are very far away. Sometimes you get this very significant peak on your GWAS, which is genome-wide association study, and it's in the middle of nowhere. And then what do you say about it? Now you have to bring in these other kinds of arguments about, maybe it's modifying the actions of multiple genes at a distant location. So the ability to provide that biological basis downstream is much more limited when we're talking about GWAS.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just gonna, one quick more question. My question is regarding testing for Native American information. Will it ever be accepted for inclusion into tribal ranks? There are a lot of people here working on that. So I think their hope is essentially, it's being worked on right now. I think that's kind of the upshot of it. Dr. Neilson, do you have anything to add to that one, or?
No, I mean, I think if the idea of acceptability would be belonging to groups completely unrelated to what we do.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that
exactly.
councils that would have to decide whether that would be acceptable to them.
And I know there are lots of folks here interested in our department and in College of Health Solutions and others that are looking at that and working with groups. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Neilson, so much for your time today. And thank you all for listening. This is all we have time for. We encourage you to follow the College of Health Solutions on social media. And we're going to pull up the hashtags there in just a minute. Okay, on the links. So you can learn about other opportunities like this one. Our Health Talk series will continue next month with a talk on exposing cancer, examining the impact of environmental and occupational factors. That talk will take place on Thursday, October 19th at noon Arizona time. So please join us at that time. Details and registration are going to be available very shortly at asuhealthtalks.com. Thank you all again so much and have a great rest of your day.